to try to examine on a very practical level what are the things that we should think about, what are the things that we should focus on, what are the things we should work on to try to do our part in remediating the cause for this outbreak, for this plague, and try to help as many people as we can. Of course, A of this is always got to be keep yourself safe. If you want to endanger yourself or your family, it's not worth it, of course. B is try to be helpful. Try to help the people that you can. If there's people who can't go shopping, if you have extra toilet paper, help your neighbors, help your friends, help your community. But what I want to examine is the guidance that our nation received from Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, who is widely considered to be the greatest Torah authority alive today. And he wrote a short letter that talks about this illness, this virus, and the three things, in his opinion, that we should work on to make sure that we ourselves are saved and our families, of course, communities are spared, but also that it's going to guard over all of our nation and all the whole world to stop this from doing too much damage. So he points out a very interesting teaching in the Talmud in the book of Arachin on page 15. The Talmud says that we know the Metzora, someone who is suffering from the affliction of tsaras. Tsaras is when these discolorations happen in your skin, in your clothing, on your home. These conditions result in someone being quarantined outside of the community. And the question the Talmud asks is, why does someone who has tsaras, why do they have to be quarantined away from everyone else? The Talmud says that what is the sin that causes tsaras? Number one amongst that list is lashon hara and gossip. Evil talk about other people and gossip. What happens when someone speaks evil about another person? See that guy, you think he's so righteous? He's really just sanctimonious. You know what that person did? Right. Someone's a gossip mongerer. Someone is always spreading salacious gossip about other people. What they're in effect doing is causing division, is causing separation, is causing factionalism, is trying to separate people from each other. And the more evil talk, the more separation. If you have friends, what could torpedo a friendship?
Mm-hmm.
Evil talk, gossip. You think this guy, you know what he actually did? You know what he said? You know what he said about you behind your back? All those things are very destructive for friendships. Friendships are unity. Gossip, lashon hara, cause disunity, cause separation. What could destroy a marriage? Lashon hara. Lashon hara is when you see something evil about the spouses or bad about the spouses, or you present the spouses to each other in a negative light, and suddenly they're not as fond of each other as they were previously. Unity becomes separation. When someone causes separation in other people, they themselves are liable to be separated, to be quarantined, to be sequestered from other people. Lashon hara is a cause for quarantine, and therefore it is something that we should work on, that we should focus on, trying to find the good in every individual, not to speak negatively of other people, and that will be a way to protect ourselves from this terrible virus. I want to add, just in line of the ideal of the theme that we've kind of strung through all these sources, plagues are about not recognizing the individual greatness and value and worth of every person. Everyone's just a number. Everyone's a statistic. No one really has any value of their own. Lashon hara is when someone tries to expose the fact that people aren't that great. People aren't that special. People aren't that unique. They don't have that much worth. And therefore, is it a shock that a plague that doesn't differentiate itself and causes division is the result of lashon hara, which again doesn't value people and causes division. And therefore, instead of trying to find the negative about other people, to try to find the positive about them, try to uplift them, to realize that they are valuable. They foster a connection between us and God. The Almighty wants them to live, and the Almighty does see value in them, and therefore we should see value in them as well, to try to identify the good, the positive, the valuable and admirable qualities and traits about other people, and focus on that instead of the negative traits that invariably all humans suffer. That would be a very useful exercise during this time. That's the first thing he writes. The first thing he writes is that we should reinforce our commitment to not speak shorter about other people, speak only kindly and positively about other people, and that would be a means to hopefully save ourselves and save our families and save our communities. The next thing he mentioned is humility. Humility. To strengthen ourselves in the characteristic of humility. As we know, arrogance, hubris, boastfulness, that is almost attacking God. Because when someone recognizes that God gives them everything that they have, that is a preventative measure, that's prophylactic against arrogance, against boastfulness. If you realize that everything you got is a gift from God, well, how could you be boastful on the gift that you have from God? You're only boastful if you don't recognize the origin, so to speak, of your skills and your abilities and your positive traits that you want to lord over other people. And therefore, this time is a time of introspection and humility to realize that everything we have is from the Almighty. And I want to add, this virus, we think of things as being small. So bacteria, small, it's invisible. Virus, small, it's invisible. Turns out that the smallest bacteria is actually larger than the largest virus. Virus is not just small, it's unfathomably small. Look what it's doing to the world around us. It's tiny, but the whole world is now quaking in its fear, so to speak, of this tiny thing. We're boastful, we're prideful. Look at me, says the Almighty. I'm going to send the smallest thing, infinitesimally small, smaller than the bacteria, the smallest microbe that we know of, and that's going to cause tremendous havoc in the world that you think you're so secure in. And in fact, there is a precedent for this in the Talmud. The Talmud talks about the animal called a yitush, or the being called yitush. The Talmud, the book of Sanhedrin, asks the question, why was humanity created on day 6? After all, maybe we should be created on day 1. It's so important. Humans really, really important, really valuable. Why does the Almighty create everything else and then create Adam on day 6 after everything else has been created? And the Talmud gives 4 different answers to that question. And the Talmud gives 4 different answers to that question. And one of the answers is that this is a means to achieve humility. Because in case Adam ever gets too boastful, you tell him, Yitush hidamcha. The Yitush, the small, tiny animal, which may be a fly, maybe a virus, it's not so clear, that came before you. How could you possibly be boastful? And there's a very long narrative in the Talmud, the book of Gittin, that talks about the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans. And it talks about Titus. Titus was the son of Vespasian. Vespasian starts the siege of Jerusalem, but he gets nominated to become the emperor, so he hands off the siege to his son, Titus, and he finishes the siege and destruction of the temple. Ultimately, he also becomes an emperor, and he succeeds his father. But the Talmud tells that after the temple is destroyed, Titus is, of course, on top of the world. He feels invincible. And once he's traveling at the sea, and this big wave comes to try to threaten to drown him. And Titus goes on to say, God, the God of Israel, only has power in water. Pharaoh started up with God, and he drowned Pharaoh in the water. Of course, by splitting the sea, the Egyptians are drowned. Sisera, he rose up against God, and God drowned him in the water. So too, I attacked God, so to speak. And God is now attacking me with water. That's the only arrow in the Almighty's quiver. It's only water. And then he makes this threat, or this, he makes this proposal to God. If you're so powerful, don't attack me in the sea. Attack me on dry land. So the Talmud goes on to say that a heavenly voice emanated and said, Rasha ben Rasha, wicked one, the son of a wicked one. You're the son of Esav, the wicked. You're just like Esav. You think I need the water. And you think I need the water to stop you? I have a tiny creature. It's called a Yitush. And I'm going to use it to destroy you. And the Talmud tells us that what happened was this Yitush, this gnat or fly or whatever it was, entered his nostril and began picking at the brain of Titus for 7 years. So he has this small animal in his head gnawing away at his brains. And then once he passes a blacksmith shop, and the blacksmith is smashing the hammer on the anvil, and this Yitush gets a little scared, and it stops. So he finally finds a solution to his problem. So he starts hiring blacksmiths to go hammer away and to stop the drilling on his head. And for 30 days, he has this blacksmith smashing 24/7, and the Yitush is held at bay. What happens after 30 days? The Yitush becomes accustomed to the sound of the blacksmith, and it continues to gnaw away at his brain. Finally, Titus died, and they did an autopsy, and the Talmud says that this tiny Yitush had grown into the size of a big bird, and it talks about the size of this bird and what it was made out of, and essentially it's describing this tiny little thing that entered Titus and became it overtook him. It commandeered him internally, and it destroyed him. And again, this is a response. This is a response to his hubris and to his challenge to God. If you really want to attack me, come attack me. He says, okay, I'll deploy this smallest of creatures, this Yitush. I have a suspicion that this Yitush is actually a virus, because the way it's described in the Talmud is that it takes stuff in, but doesn't expel stuff out. And we know that the virus does not actually doesn't have this mitosis, doesn't split like normal or like regular organisms. It just commandeers the cells. It's like a parasite, but not something which spits out, but not something which spits out replicas of itself. And again, we see that the pathology of the virus is something which exposes human fragility and human fallibility. And we think that we've got it all, and this really tiny thing, the tiniest of microbes, comes and totally upends our world. And I think the third thing that Rabbi Kanievsky writes is the idea of letting others win, yielding to others. And I think the idea of that is that when someone is allowing others to win, when someone's not selfish, they recognize that we're really interconnected. There's a certain degree of interdependence. Maybe we can suggest that the virus, after all, the virus reminds us, the lesson that it's trying to tell us is that all of humanity, and certainly all the Jewish people, we're like one being. And if I'm sick, God forbid, I can convey that to you, even if we don't realize that we're connected, but the virus is reminding us that we're all connected. And if we're all really connected, then me yielding to someone else, letting them win, is not really a loss. So should shuls have services or not? So I find that there's been different attitudes in various different communities, various different synagogues. Some of them, well, again, if the state says it's not okay to have a gathering, that's one thing. But if the state says okay, provided there's sufficient social distancing and the like, everyone washes their hands and make sure that people stay of a safe distance from each other. Should the shul stay open or should they close? So I've seen some shuls that have this overabundance of caution, and even if the state says it's okay to not have services, to not have shul. Others say, let's have shul, but let's make sure that we maintain the social distancing. So in our community, some of the shuls remain open, some of them closed. And incidentally, one of the shuls that I participated in their services, they had davening outside, they had the prayer outside in the backyard to reinforce the social distancing. Anyhow, one of the neighbors, we have a non-Jewish neighbor who's not so happy about the prayers outside. In the middle of the prayer Friday night, he opens his window and starts barking at the crowd and says, "Get inside! Do you want me to pull out my boombox and start playing loud music over here?" Like middle of davening, because everyone just hustles inside. I remember thinking, what a beautiful time to be alive. It used to be that the Gentiles said, you can't go to shul. And now they're saying, you have to go to shul. You have to go inside. I just thought that was such a nice little thing to think about, the fact that we have the Gentiles here who are pushing us inside. But anyhow, it's just an interesting time to think about that the shuls are closed. Many of them are closed. Many of them are shuttered. Even the ones that are open are not at full capacity. And then you have the yeshivos that are closed. And it made me think of the curse of Bilam. Of course, in the book of Numbers, we read, Bilam is hired to go curse the Jewish people. And the Talmud says that if you examine his blessings that he was forced to give, you can discover what the opposite intent was, what was his plan to curse, and he was forced to give the opposite of that, to give a blessing. So, for example, he starts off, Ma tovu olacha Yaakov. How goodly are your tents, Jacob. He's blessing the tents of the Jewish people, the synagogues, and the halls of study. His plan was to curse the Jewish people. We shouldn't have a shul. We shouldn't have a hall of study-based medrash. And he was forced to give a blessing that they will always have them. Then he gives a list of all the blessings that he gave and what was the opposite intent, what was his plan to go curse the Jewish people. The Talmud concludes, this is the book of Sanhedrin, page 105b, all of his blessings ultimately reverted back to being curses, with the exception of one of them. There was one blessing that he gave. He had intended to make a curse, but it was forced to do a blessing. There was one blessing that he gave that never reverted back to being a curse. And that is the first one, Matovu Alecha Yaakov. You'll always have halls of study and prayer amongst the Jewish people. So it made me thinking, are we making a terrible mistake? Are we making a terrible mistake by closing the shul? If the Talmud says that the shuls and the yeshivos and the Beit Midrash will never close, and that's a promise, the curse was permanently turned into a blessing, are we making a huge blunder by closing? That was my initial thought. And then I was maybe trying to rationalize the decisions, again, not any specific decisions, but the collective decisions of many different shuls that closed all over the world. Maybe the rationale is as follows, just like Rabbi Salanter, when he made this rule that no one's allowed to fast in Yom Kippur, it wasn't because everyone was on the verge of dying, but many people were, and unless it was this blanket ruling, people are going to die. So I'm thinking there's a lot of elderly people that come to shul, people that are squarely in the danger zone of contracting the disease and potentially dying. And unless we close the whole shul, they're going to show up. Many of them will show up. And that is a risk that we cannot bear. That was my rationale. But ultimately, as I thought about it, I was thinking that no, the Talmud's clear. This curse of Bilam was turned into a permanent blessing. And therefore, there is a permanent blessing that's associated with the shuls. Of course, when they're open, the blessing's obvious. Our job now, during these very trying times, is to try to figure out what is the blessing in the temporary closure of the shuls. I think that's the attitude we have to have. What can we do during this very unusual period to try to say, I'm going to make a blessing out of the curse, so to speak, that appears to be a curse, but really is a blessing? I had an interesting thought as well. There was a study done in 2015, very interesting study. I'm very fond of this study. It was done in England. So England has a very complicated network of subways in London. And certain portions of the tube, as it's called, have had various strikes, and they've closed various routes of the very labyrinthine network of the London Underground. So once there was a tube strike, and the study was of how, even though people's daily commutes were upended, ultimately the tube strike saved time for the commuters, that they saved more time than they would have if the tube did not go on strike. Why? The rationale is like this. Because it's such a complicated system that not everyone was necessarily taking the more efficient route to their destination. And because everyone was forced to experiment, to try new routes during this tube strike, that certain parts of the network were closed, a small percentage of people actually found that their new route was more optimized, was faster, and then once the tube strike ended, they just kept their new route, and therefore the net result was that people saved time and didn't lose time. That was this study. And the abstract reads, this is a quote, "We argue that the information produced by the strike improved network efficiency. Search costs are, okay, fine. Instead, this is the takeaway line. Individuals seem to under-experiment in normal times, as a result of which constraints can be welfare improving." This is the idea that I want to share. This is not normal times that we're living in. This is very unusual times. People are homebound. People are working from home. People are studying from home. People are praying from home. People are with their children at home. Normally the kids are in school, they're in camp, they're away. It's very unusual times. But I think there is the silver lining, just on a very personal level for each individual. Of course, there's a lot of sadness, a lot of illness, and a lot of people suffering. But I think it's also a time that we could experiment and try to find new ways to improve the efficiency of our life. Of course, our regular life, but certainly our spiritual life, to find different ways that we can connect God to Torah, to mitzvos, to study in ways that maybe will linger once things go back to normal. And that's just an open-ended idea that everyone should try to figure out ways that they can experiment to try to find something that normally they wouldn't have even tested, but maybe something that they could experiment with now, and maybe we'll stay with them as things normalize. I want to also share a personal thought. I shared this with my colleagues here at Torch. We ran our campaign, our fundraising campaign, our annual fundraising campaign, the first week in March. And we know the listeners, the podcast listeners, and the participants in the class, everyone was so generous in helping make the campaign a success. But we snuck in this campaign the last week, I think, before it would have been untenable to do it. Today, in the environment that we're in today, it's impossible to try to do a fundraising campaign today. Everyone's life has been so changed and altered and people's finances are so uncertain, this is not the environment that we can do our campaigns. I'm just thankful. We do a campaign a year, and if we weren't able to do it, I don't know how we would have managed throughout the year. I just want to publicly say thank you to the Almighty that He held off the virus for a little bit longer and allowed our organization to run our campaign. The Mir Yeshiva, largest yeshiva in the world, they have their annual dinner. It's at the end of March. Of course, they postponed the dinner this year. But a lot of organizations are really suffering and really trying to figure out how they're going to raise the money that they need in a time like this. But also, if you've had something scheduled, at this time, it's a huge challenge. And I want to just thank the Almighty that we were able to get the campaign out before everything changed. I have another interesting thought that I want to share. I was doing a lot of research about viruses and flus and H1N1. There's the H and the N, which are these are like the linings of every virus, and the number of the H and the number of the N, the term is the name. But I found something so fascinating that I have to share it. Apparently, again, I'm not a virologist, I'm not a physician, but this is what I've researched. And you correct me if I'm wrong. Let me know if I'm wrong. Fact check me. Apparently, most flu viruses come from birds. But as far as we know, humans cannot contract flu directly from birds. And the reason for that is because a virus, like we said, it's not its own cell that infiltrates the body. It's actually a microbe that attaches to the cell of the host, but it has to latch onto what's called a receptor. There's receptors in cells that can absorb or the virus can latch onto. And as far as we know, there isn't a receptor in humans for avian flu, for flu from birds. And therefore it has to find, so to speak, some middle go-between an animal or an organism through which the bird flu can latch onto, and that can pass it on to humans. So apparently, the in-between animal is none other than the pig. Pigs have both human and bird flu receptors, so they're this bridge that connects us to the source, so to speak, of the flu, to the source of the impurity, if you will, and that's the birds. So you have the bird gets the flu, passes it to the pig, and the pig passes it to the human. And this just kind of struck me so hard. The Torah is warning us that there's the swine, which is the apex of impurity, and only today we know that actually this is the animal most likely to be the one to convey all kinds of viruses and flus and influenzas to humanity. I did also want to share, I saw an amazing video of the first Israeli coronavirus case of someone who completely recovered and was released from the hospital. I don't know if you've seen this, you can Google it. There was a news story about this, the first Israeli to be released from hospitalization, who totally recovered from this coronavirus. It's amazing. They interview him. He's leaving the hospital, and he covers his eyes, and on top of his lungs, he screams, Shema Yisrael Hashem HaKadosh Echad. Of course, the declaration of our allegiance to God. And then he says, the blessing, that God gave us life, and God gave us vitality, and God brought us to this day. I think that really epitomizes the Jewish attitude towards events like this. We believe that the virus is sent by God to send us a message, to send to us some sort of lesson we have to take home. It's not there just some sort of natural thing that just happens. That's the illusion. Really, the Almighty is speaking to us. And our objective is to try to absorb the message. And we've seen a lot of different attitudes, different ideas of what we can do to improve. We've seen Generally speaking, the idea that a plague is all about indiscrimination, not viewing people as individuals. Everyone is just the same. And we saw specifically that a sexual misconduct is something which is likely to trigger that. And we speculated that when someone doesn't recognize the unique individual power that they were given by God to be a creator to some degree, when they don't acknowledge that, then something of indiscriminate nature, a plague of indiscriminate nature, is unleashed against the world. We also saw that when someone counts other people and they do the census without recognizing the value of each individual, that is something which is likely to unleash the plague. And we saw stories of plagues and stories of quarantines. We saw from the greatest Jew that's alive today, Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, who told us that we should work on 3 themes to avoid speaking gossip, to avoid having hubris and arrogance and boastfulness, to have humility, and to let others win. And we saw each one of these ideas connect to some of the themes of plagues and thus plague avoidance. So we have before us 7 different things that we've mentioned. Generally speaking, we talked about the idea of viewing each person as an individual. Recognize the value of each individual. Uplift the individual. Recognize that every individual Jew is someone that you need to foster connection between you and God. We saw the 3 sins that caused the plague of Noah and the 3 plagues in the Torah. They are, of course, idolatry. Let's not be enslaved to the Jew that you always were. Let's be comfortable to take the blood and post it on our doorposts. Theft. Recognize that what other people have is given to them by God, not to try to encroach on other people. Sexual misconduct, as we mentioned, that's 4. And finally, the 3 ideas that we saw, namely, to not speak Lashon Hara, to not speak, to be more humble, and to let others win. We have 7 different suggestions. My advice would be is that everyone select for themselves one of these things to think about and to work upon, and create a regimen for yourself to say, I'm going to do my share. Of course, your number 1 responsibility is to guard your own health and the health of the people around you. But provided that you're able to maintain safety and follow the rules and the regulations given to us by the health officials, try to help other people as much as you can, and try to take this time, these days, these weeks, whatever it may be, to pick one of these 7 things that you can work on, create for yourself a regimen to work on it, and hopefully in that merit, you will be doing your share to make sure that this virus is not going to influence, or it's not going to be as dangerous as potentially it could be, and you're going to do your share to save you and your family and to save all of us and the entire world from the devastation of this pandemic. My email address again is robinwolbe@gmail.com. I am happy to take any questions, any comments, and any feedback.